of the public as a whole and how to sort of get better at it to avoid the annoying judge screws that we all know and love. So, first question that is really has different definitions around the circuit is sort of who are lay judges in general. And at the very top of the iceberg, it necessarily means that judges that have little to no experience with PF. So when you look at it, it's usually parents whose kids are competitors or coaches that have been out, coaches and um old competitors that have been out of this activity for a while who are unfamiliar with the latest norms around the circuit. And these judges are commonly found on the national circuit, but they're more prominent on the local circuit, meaning that in your state tournament, for example, is probably mostly lays unless you debate or unless you debate a super technical tournament like TFA states, for example, which I think is the only technical state tournament in the country for PF at least. So you really need to understand how to sort of who these judges are and how to improve at your lay technique in order to be able to solve your problem with lay judges as a whole. And overall, they typically vote off of three factors. First of all, is your overall speaking skill. Second of all, is sort of your overall debating skill. So, how well you clash with what your opponents say, how well you debate as a whole. And then finally, just the overall truth of your speeches, which we'll sort of get into a little bit later when we talk about, hey, this is exactly what needs to be done to make sure that you're able to win and be better on these specific aspects. So, first, a lot of common problems that I've seen novices and JV and everyone face in my specific experiences all have trouble identifying judges if they're lay judges or flay judges or technical judges. So here is one that is considered a lay judge, and I consider this sort of a little bit easier down the spectrum. And this one is most of these judges that are lay judges will therefore say in their paradigm, I am a lay judge or I am a lay parent judge. And they will usually give you a sort of list of, hey, this is what I want to see in the round to make sure that I'm able to give the best overall experience in the round. And this usually has things like how well you articulate your words and your arguments, your organization as a whole throughout your case, and over your overall speaking skill, which is what you see that the full paradigm is about. Second of all, is that a lot of in technical rounds, you've seen top debaters use foul language like cussing and things like that. If you cuss in a lay round, it's almost game over in the sense that they think you're not treating it as professional as you should be. And finally, is sort of being considerate. The really big problem that I still face with lay judges is voting off of Crossfire. So the problem with Crossfire is that, especially when you come to online tournaments, it's not specifically you lose a lot of rounds just because your opponents might make may seem them to be more confident when in reality you're just not being able to let your words and respond to it as a whole. I mean that it's harder for a lay judge to sort of um, evaluate the crossfire, which is what a lot of judges end up voting on. So we'll get into more about that, about how to sort of optimize that as a whole. Here's a little bit of a harder one. And when I debated, so this was my sophomore year at a national circuit, I actually interpreted this paradigm incorrectly. So I thought this was a flow judge. Because, well, not like a hyper technical flow judge, but more of a flow judge on sort of the flay spectrum. So the couple of things that sort of really tipped me off towards it being a flay rather than a lay was one, saying that I will be flowing, but B, that he did PF and judge a few years ago, which when I was debating, I thought it was like 3 or 4 years ago, which relatively the norms haven't changed too much from like 2022 2023. So I thought, hey, it'd be fine, let's just read a little bit of a technical case. So the reason why you can tell it's a lay judge over a flay judge is a couple things. First of all, is one, again, they look at no yelling or hostility as one of their rules. But remember that when you look at technical judges, for example, if you search up, let's say, Arnav Mehta from Seven Lakes on Tabroom, you'll probably see that, hey, I understand a lot of technical judges like him have have saying that, hey, I know rounds get heated, but make sure that you're sort of able to take it a step back and sort of grow to enjoy the experience as a whole, which is super important for debate as a whole and is what a lot of people prioritize. But second of all, what really tips you off is that he really looks for rhetorical strategy. So for example, him saying, "Oh, I really look for logos, ethos, and pathos," is something that's relatively uncommon in sort of the technical aspect, because most technical judges just say, "Hey, win the flow, I'll vote for you." So prioritizing that also shows that he's a little bit more of a lay than a flay or a technical judge. So before we sort of get into the speech by speech, there's a few general tips I have to sort of optimize your performance in the round as a whole. So first of all is slow and clear speaking. So everyone says from every I've taught a lot of debaters with this exact same slideshow on how to get better at lay debate, and the majority of sort of comments I get is, "Hey, I go slow in every lay round. Why doesn't it work?" It's because every person has a sort of different range of what they consider slow and understandable. So you have to make sure that you adapt to that pace rather than doing what you think is slow in that sense. So the golden rule that I found is when you're going slow, I read 650 to 700 words at the very max on the lane. Maybe 750, but that's really, really pushing it from what it has in my experience. The judge usually should have a lot of prior topical knowledge and should be a little bit of a flow judge in a sense to sort of understand the ideas that you're putting out to be able to evaluate that as a whole. Second is really physical organization. So I'm sure a lot of you debate on the national circuit, and when you go to in-person tournaments, a really common thing that judges say is that, hey, when I walk into the room, I want the email chain to be set up, I want the coin flip to be done, and I just want you both teams to be ready. But when a team isn't ready, that makes them really unhappy, and it can overall hurt your performance as a whole. Additionally, it also sort of impacts your speaker points, which can go on to hurt you at big tournaments like Harvard, for example, which many of you may be going to this weekend. Next is sort of debate organization. I like to call lay debate as a little bit of a mystery depending on the judge, right? So you don't really know what they're going to specifically vote off of to make their decision. So the easiest way to sort of avoid that and making sure that you're covering every single thing that's said is using ballot directive language. So when my coach was first sort of teaching me how to use ballot directive language, the way that he'd make me give my summaries would say, let's open up tabroom.com, let's sign your ballot and vote together, and then I'd explain the reasoning why. So using ballot directive language in a sense is signposting, but it helps a lot more than that. It helps you make sure that your link chains are logical and making sure that you're doing well overall. Second thing is that some lay judges, believe it or not, are competent. So for those judges, what do you want to do? You want to sort of still win the flow, but still go slow. So that means you still should be using a little bit of technical argumentation, meaning that you should still try and win the flow. You should still try and win the weighing debate. So for example, not for example. That will still allow you to pick up some lay judges who have been in the activity for a while. For example, a close friend of mine, his dad, he has an older brother who debated in 2019, 2020, and now he is debating. So his dad has been judging since 2018. And so he sort of understands the round a little bit. So he's able to flow and give basic decisions. So for those rounds, you want to be able to win the flow. But remember, you have to limit the jargon that you use. Things like, oh, you can turn this and then delink this is going to be a lot harder for you to respond to as a whole. Final tip generally is that control your hair and your arm movement. So I think it's really, really easy to start sort of waving your hands around as you give your speech or messing with your hair because that's something that comes naturally to everyone. But I've simply lost rounds because my partner or me has been waving my arms around too much, which has become distracting or being like pushing my hair around has also caused the judge to say, hey, that's not really professional. And also, that same thing applies with putting your hands in your pockets during the round. So, making sure that you're avoiding those things can also sort of benefit you as a whole when it comes to speaker points and the overall course when it comes to behavior in the round. Uh, if anyone has any questions, just feel free to unmute and ask. I see something in the chat. Okay, never mind. If anyone has anything, put them in the chat or you can unmute just depending on whatever your user preference is really is. Next is a little bit of speech by speech. So I'm not going to watch the videos. I think Steven will post this later. So you can obviously go through and sort of see how they're read. But the biggest advice that I have for anyone who's struggling to write a lay case is be logical. It's easy to read arguments that link into extinction and just go in up in summary and say, "Hey, extinction outweighs four warrants." But a lay judge isn't going to understand that. They won't even believe that human extinction happens in the first place. So you have to choose a lot more of a plausible argument as a whole. That's sort of really important to making sure that they're able to understand the crossfire and making sure that they have an argument to vote off of in the overall structure of the round. And the next thing that you really need to make sure is that a lot of debaters tell you that debate is not an English essay. And as a debater, I 100% agree. I don't think it's an English essay, but I still think it has a lot of elements similar to an English essay. For example, I still think you need to use a lot of clear and constructive phrasing, but to also have the proper transition words in order to be able to succeed as a whole. So I think that's some things that are really, really important, which I'll sort of show when I show you guys the lay case, the example lay case that I have. And next thing is really sort of a narrative, which I'll sort of show in the example case, but essentially it should be something that says, hey, this is the story. It's a story that should tell the it's sorry, it's a story that should tell the structural integrity of your argument. Yeah. So there's someone to mute. AS or Ani, do you have any questions, or if so, can you mute just to make sure there's not any background noise? Okay, perfect. So that's essentially what it would sort of be. So let's look at this late case. Um, okay, AS, that's fine. Okay, so this was for those of you who have been on the circuit for a while, this was a prep group called FC Baller, and they were some of the best teams in the country, and they ended up closing out TOC, which in quarters, which is sorry, they closed it out in semis and they ended up winning the whole thing as well. And this is something that obviously is very, very impressive coming from debaters who want to debate as a whole. But let's talk about sort of how they structure this lay case as well. So there's a couple elements of this lay case that I think are really, really important. So first of all is obviously the narrative. So the narrative should be something that sort of tells the story of your argument. So for example, this topic was on Article 9. So it was if Japan should adopt offensive military capabilities or not. In this case, this was a neg case. So what this argument sort of goes on and talks about is saying that, hey, if we allow Japan to get weapons, it's going to lead to militarism all over the world, which is an overall red flag because it would lead to a lot of conflicts and such. And that's the sort of narrative and that's the sort of technique that they go for. Despite years of alarmism, the liberal world order is still standing strong. So the way that I usually like to structure my narratives is that there's two ways. So first of all, you see it in this one. Um, it's sort of a paragraph or so of an overview, but here's a little bit more of a recent example. Let me, I guess I have to pull up on my drive. Okay. Yeah. Here's a little bit more of a recent example is that if my case wants to load. Here's a little bit more of a recent example on delay is dog, why is my computer glitching? Okay, so is sort of talking about something starting with the statement that's super common and that's super understandable. So in this case, this was our border surveillance case in saying that we've been told time and time again that surveillance is on our southern border will stop undocumented immigration. So the way that I would structure your narrative is sort of talk again like a basic contention. Start with your uniqueness, then go to your link and go to your impact and explain why it's sort of impactful. So in this case, it's saying that we've been told time and time again that surveillance on our southern border will stop undocumented immigration, but it doesn't because it's about expanding the government at the expense of our values, which is why it leads to a perceptual crisis, which is the overall impact. So this is something that, in my experience, is a non-negotiable in a lay debate case because that's something that every lay judge sort of looks for, and it's sort of a theme connecting each one of your arguments, which is going to be overall key. Next thing that's important when it comes to constructive is just sort of the transition words. So you can see the transition words in a couple of places here. So the first, when you're talking about a lay case, my personal suggestion is to always read a sole contention, right? And sole contention in the sense that one, it allows you to do your weighing a lot easier because they're all overall related, which means you can just overall weight each of your arguments at a time, which saves you a lot of time in summary, especially when you're going to have to extend a lot of arguments. But second, remember, see how it sort of provides the transition words from argument to argument. So first, it talks about in the status quo, and in debate, that's commonly known as what is happening right now. Then it talks about how this isn't a failure, it's a plan, and sort of goes from there. And finally, the result. Using these small transition phrases may not be a big thing, but it's been super helpful for a lot of judges that really don't understand what debate is, especially if they're coming from a different sort of country. Then here's Crossfire. So this is when I think is a really, really undervalued part in Crossfire that I think needs to be really, really emphasized for any debater who's trying to go from someone who isn't really doing well to really, really well. So the first thing is being polite. And I think the biggest problem that a lot of people have came up to me and said is that sure I can be polite all I want, but if they're gonna take like 3 4 minutes of they're gonna take all 3 minutes of Crossfire to ask one question and I don't, how can I stop them? So the way that I would do it is I would let them have one follow-up question at max, but then take it back and say, hey, actually, can I take a question? It's been nearly half of Crossfire, and I haven't really been able to speak and offer my thoughts. And using that phrase a couple times, even if your opponents are sort of stingy in that sense, will help you sort of improve as a whole. From there, don't let a lot of technical judges say, "Hey, if you want to skip Grand Cross, go ahead. I'll give you guys a minute of prep." And when you're on a panel with a lay or two, or you're debating a prelim round, I'd suggest never skipping any sort of Crossfire because one, it helps the judge make sure that they are in the right mind to make the correct decision. But two, it also helps you make sure that you're able to redefine and re-explain your argument, which ensures that it is understood as a whole. Third is really, really making sure that you have good preparation on the argument. So, for example, um, making sure that one, your each sort of point of controversy in the round has been resolved on your argument because each time that it's brought up it'll cast an additional sense of doubt into the judge's mind, so you want to make sure that those are sort of offered first. Remember to also research is a huge thing here, especially on the topics that we've been getting. For example, generative AI in education, which is the March topic, a big part about this is historical examples because a lot of these resolutions have already happened, meaning that at least to some scale. So you should be able to look at the previous impact and what the upcoming impact is to making sure that you have the best overall argument. And that also shows good preparation and increases your overall credibility with the judge, which, in my opinion, is really, really incredibly key. So, this is an example Crossfire. Obviously, I will let you guys watch it on your own time to see sort of how the debaters sort of structure their thoughts to make sure that they're constructive as a whole. Rebuttal. So, rebuttal is one of the most important speeches in the round when it comes to lay rounds, right? So, the very, very easiest way to sort of win rebuttal on the lay is to sort of look at how simple your rhetoric is. You don't want to say, hey, one here on the internal link. You don't want to use that jargon. You just want to say on their argument about innovation, they say a couple of things, but first, but second, but third. So making sure that you're signposting and showing your organization when it comes to your rebuttal is going to be incredibly key for you. Third is citing credible evidence, right? So, for example, let's say that I was reading Case. This is something that should also apply to Case. I believe that I missed it on the constructive side, is sort of saying Dr. Marissa Wright from Harvard University in 2023 explains X, Y, and Z. Doing so really increases your credibility, right? Because it shows that one, you're sort of only looking at credible experts, which if they're not reading their overall profession names of their authors, that it gives you a step up. But two, it also shows that you've done your research and understand your author's credibility as a whole. Fourth, the big thing that sort of differentiates lay debate and technical debate is the amount of warranting that you have to do as a whole. So when it comes to a technical round, warranting is everything. If you lose the warranting, you might as well lose the round because the warranting is what's going to sign the judge's ballot. But we know lay round, the burden of proof is on you to prove that it's wrong. So you have to go all out when it comes to the warranting debate because you want to make sure that you're winning it as a whole, which is what you should be doing in rebuttal. Next, in my opinion, the way to best sort of give a lay rebuttal is to make sure that every single argument that you read is going to be linking back to your narrative. So, for example, if I was reading a structural framework as a structural violence framework as my sort of overview, I would make sure to explain how each individual claim affects minorities or people who are underrepresented. That increases the organization in a lot of judges' minds, which is an overall benefit. And there's an example. Ryan from Medina does an incredibly great job in any of his lay rounds. So making sure that if you're looking for rounds, I'd suggest that's a very, very good round to watch. Summary and final focus. So this is sort of a very, very big part of the round, and this is sort of really, really wants to define it. And the big picture that you really need to understand is that there's no foolproof way to win a lay round. A lot of judges will evaluate second final focus. For example, at Columbia, my team gave second final focus. We went a little bit new, not anything new. It was just a new implication in final focus. The judge allowed the opponents to respond to what we said and do a shit ton more what's it called, analysis that wasn't in the previous speech because she thought there was something called the 3AC in public forum, which does not exist. It only goes rebuttal, summary, final focus, which ends with the 2AR, which is sort of confusing, but we ended up losing the round because the judge thought that it was allowed. Here's an example summary. So Brentwood HM, their first speaker is fantastic. His name is William Hong, and he was actually one of my mentors when I was first starting debate. But any of his lay rounds that you can watch are something that will be immensely helpful as a whole. Yeah. I will post it. I will send it to Steven after the meeting, and then he could post it whenever he feels is ready to post. So next is sort of quality over quantity, and this sort of comes in for rebuttal as well, in the sense that in the technical round, you want to read as many arguments as you can to make sure that you're able to sort of have some sort of conceded defense, which will ensure that you're able to win the round. But my golden rule in lay rounds is if you're speaking second, obviously this is a little bit different. But if you're speaking first, I would give 4 to 5 responses per contention, assuming that you have them, and then going on and doing a little bit of weighing at the end. Because a huge part about lay debate is allowing them to hear your comparison to making sure that you're able to do that as a whole. If you're second summary and final focus, you have a very, very big structural advantage, which everyone should be taking advantage of because you have the opportunity to hear new. The second thing that's important about that is that there's something called the recency effect, in the sense that any individual that you look at, they learn what they started with and what they ended with the very, very best. So if you're giving second final focus, the judge sort of understands what he what you did in second final focus better than every other speech in the round. And I think that's what a lot of very, very good teams do. If you look at that, or if you look at the Mission San Jose round versus Palo Alto, they also do very, very well in that sense. So drills. You're probably wondering, hey, I understand all this about lay debate, but how do I sort of get better? So the first thing you need to do is really highlight your weakness and what it is in debate. If it is lay debate, then there's a couple ways that you're able to fix it. First of all, you can sort of enroll in a lot of mentorship programs that are free, to making sure that you're able to sort of get at least some sort of dedicated coach to making sure that you're able to understanding. And once your coach is able to sort of highlight the weakness that you're facing, you'll be able to sort of jump off from there, because you'll be able to understand what needs to be done in order to win a lay round. But when you look at just generally, from what I've had, is that the most useful is sort of speech redos. And what this necessarily means is that um you want to sort of save your flows from the tournament, go back up to wherever you see. Let's say your desk, for example, right? You pull out your flow and you do the same exact summary, but in less time, which sort of continues to build it up. And that's really important, right? Because you want to make sure that you're avoiding the things that are sort of plaguing you in lay debate as a whole. So, for example, let's say technical language is your weak spot. And as someone who sort of debated technically starting out my career as a freshman, that's where it sort of really, really um sort of hurt my belief of what lay debate was. And the way that I would do it is, let's say you're a first speaker, right? I would sort of pull out my phone, I'd give my summary in 3 minutes, and then I would start cutting down from 2 minutes 30 seconds to 2 minutes to 1 minute 30 seconds to see how efficient I could get without using technical language. And every time I'd use a technical word, I would restart. And that same thing goes for stuttering. So it's not an easy thing to get over stuttering, and I know a lot of debaters who have had this problem growing up, and it's not something that they can control. So making sure that you're able to sort of do these speech redos will help you outgrow your specific skill set when it comes to starting as a whole. And organization will also get better at multiple tries. Remember, these are the sort of three biggest problems that I've seen in my experiences as a speech and debate student, but obviously that there's more. The final sort of drill that I could really think of is sort of a paperless flowless drill. And this is for people who worry too much about the flow or go too much about the paper in the sense that you're not making eye contact, which is another fundamental part of lay debate, and you're just going off of your note card. So making sure that you're able to sort of debate without a float is an interesting strategy, because one, no participants not allowed to be flowed, meaning that the clash hardly exists, meaning that one, it's not going to be a very good round, but two, it'll still show you to sort of go in on one or two arguments and sort of explain how they win the round specifically. Finally, sort of making sure that you sort of understand sort of where you're missing. So for a flowless or paperless judge, flowless or paperless drill, right? The biggest importance is that you're not really looking at the technical part so much, and you're sort of looking more at the public speaking part of things. And there's one person, his name was Devesh Kodnani, who won nationals in 2018. His first debate coach made him speak with a paper or nothing rather than a computer, because you want to rely on prerequisite ideas rather than piggybacking on others for your overall work. So this is sort of more in the competitions type of sense. Oh, wait, so one more tip on sort of the back half is the sense that these two should be fully the same. And you're probably saying, "Hey, Kaushik, didn't you just talk about how you could be abusive in second final focus to win the round?" Yeah, you absolutely can, but still, most judges that I've encountered at least has some sort of common sense in which they're able to sort of understand saying, hey, this argument didn't come up a lot at all, whereas this argument is. So making sure that you're consistent with the summary and the back half is a super important strategy that I believe is underutilized. Next is sort of competition tips. So I'll talk about online rounds and in-person rounds here because I know that sort of both are applicable in the modern status quo. So first of all, no matter where your tournament is, always make sure that you arrive to your round early. So the way that a lot of teams like to do it is that they like to prep from the wiki and then go to their round. I like heavily discourage against that because when you get to big buildings like Emory, for example, or Harvard, it's going to be take a little bit of a minute to find your room, which it makes it a lot harder and increases time pressure when you're trying to find the room if the other team might be there. So making sure that you're able to show that as a whole. Finally, if you get to round early and let's say my cases are perfect, my blocks are perfect, I don't need any help, don't just sit there like a mute person, making sure that you sort of interact with the judge, sort of show your kindness, and just sort of talk about like debate, talking about other things. So, for example, I went to Nova Titan, which is a tournament in Florida, um, in October, and one of my round one judges eventually turned out to be a lawyer who even offered me a law internship later down the line. So they help you build connections as well. So making sure that you're able to do that as well. So the next thing is that a lot of us like to sort of abuse calling for cards in the sense that, hey, send everything and we want to make sure that we're able to read through every single argument that you read. And yes, that's a great strategy. 3 minutes, I guess, is still not enough time. But making sure that you don't call for too many cards is also important, especially if you could consider the fact that that card most likely is not the reason why you're winning or you're losing. So making sure that you're keeping that in mind is key. Finally, so yeah, you want to really show off that you're a human as a whole. So obviously continue to maintain kindness with everyone that you sort of go on to meet. But finally, sort of in person, there's a couple things, and then I'll get to these online things. So my like current partner, his ex partner, she would input. So just for the context, she's a girl, and whenever she would see like a female team, she'd stop and say, "Oh, I really like your fit. I really like how you did your makeup. I really like your hair," and that sort of increases your presence as a person in the round rather than an overall debater, which is sort of something that she's found super helpful. Also, make sure you're always using formal attire. So I've had people drop because they show up in smiley face t-shirts to rounds. Remember, late debate isn't a joke. It's the sort of essence of public forum debate. So you want to make sure that you're preparing accordingly and making sure that you have everything. So these are all sort of important tips when it comes to online debate. In-person debate, we already sort of talked about coming to the round sooner rather than earlier is something that it's important. But two, also making sure that you have the email chains sort of set up. When it comes to sort of um, in-person tournaments, and you're let's say you're on a flight, right? Flight one or flight two, you still have to make your email chain no matter where you are and share it with the judge if they request it. So that is something that is super important in that sense. Next is sort of talking about other charities, for example. So for this case, a this was a sort of yeah, so this was sort of a overall application of lay debate as a whole when it comes to that. So miscellaneous tips, right? So there's a lot of miscellaneous tips that can sort of make or break a round. But in general, I found a couple of these tips to be the most helpful. First is sort of putting a one sentence phrase to making sure that it grabs your attention. So for example, something like if it ain't broke, don't fix it, or don't put a band-aid on a bullet wound. And these sort of metaphors should sort of overall exemplify your argument as a whole. And usually the way that teams read this is not in case but more in summary, and obviously with this thing ain't, it's a little bit less professional, so you want to make sure that you're able to find the most professional way possible to sort of tell the judge how to do it. And when you get into deep and stressful rounds, you'll get to the point to start to blame lay judges. Yeah, I don't know how many of you were here before, but right before the call, I was talking to Steven about how I retired because I didn't like the Columbia judging pool. So making sure that you're not giving up. You sort of recognizing that it's two steps forward for every one step backward is also really important. Also, making sure that um, your work is also turned in is something that's also important when it comes to things like speeches, for example. Finally, it's like when you get into sort of rounds where you think it's unfair, it's a really, really common to post round with judges as a whole. I think that post rounding is a very educational activity, in my opinion. So I definitely suggest that you sort of go on and do it. But remember, is that you want to maintain a respectful rather than a controversial tone because it can aggravate specific judges and making sure that they're able to overall help as a whole. So that's the start of this slideshow. Does anyone have any questions? And then I have a few more tips that I want to share. I'll give you guys until like 6:43, like I'll give you guys 4 minutes to unmute and see if you guys have anything. If not, I'll shut the next slideshow.
I do have a question.
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay, so my partner and I we are about to debate Harvard this weekend, right?
Yeah.
And we're very excited because we want to run a structural balance case for the neg. So I was thinking is if we should also use like the SB thing framework in a late round, or would like it just confuse the judge more?
Yeah, so a question about that, right? When you say framing, are you reading it like actual words, or are you just trying to explain that this argument is the most important round in the round? Because the language you use is sort of important when you sort of make decisions like that.
We do have like two reasons on why like warranting the SB thing, but it's like simple. Like the narrative is pretty late.
Yeah, so I don't think the narrative that you go for specifically matters. If you just want to make sure that you have the highest quality framework to read, so just read the one that you think would be best, or if you have a coach, I'd ask him. Does that answer your question? Oh yeah, I'm assuming it does. Unmute if it doesn't. Does anyone have any other questions?
Yeah, so over the weekend I was at Stanford and I lost in pretty far out because in like a 2-1 decision because my judge said like overall their case had like a better narrative. So this is just specific to the topic. So for ICC like on the AV,
Yeah.
the narrative is typically like, crimes are bad, we need to prosecute, but how could the neg develop a lay friendly narrative?
Yeah. So there's a couple ways that I think you can develop a super proper narrative on delay here. So when you're neg, let me think for a second. Okay, so the neg my sort of from my research, the neg is that you have to choose an actor that you're going for. So either have it as the US or the ICC. So if let's say you choose the ICC, right? So the way that you can frame it is one, the US right now has a foreign policy balance. Trump has decided which ones that he sort of is going to pursue and which one that he's sort of not going to pursue. And from there, if you join the ICC, it's going to disrupt that balance, which overall leads to a variety of impacts depending on the legislation that it sort of trades off from. Second is that right now we find a perfect balance with condemning our international neighbors, but also maintaining our own domestic growth. But when you join the ICC, they're responsible for showing missions and providing troops and resources for every single mission. That's overall really bad because it hurts the funding that we have and the resources that we have that could be used for better overall causes. Third way is that one, um, right now the world is peaceful. Yes, there are crimes being conducted, but nothing is hurting the US. But when the US sort of enters and accedes into the ICC, that's overall bad because it throws off military readiness, meaning the fact that it trades off with the military funding, which forces us to waste resources. So you could take this a couple ways in the sense that you could do it as military or any other like legislation that you can think of. And the way that I would sort of phrase that is Um, joining the ICC is a gamble that the US is not willing to take or not ready to take is the best way to do that in my opinion. But on the other hand, if you wanted to choose the ICC or the world, um, I would say one, the ICC has found a perfect balance because the big three great powers, India, China, and Russia, I mean, not India, sorry, US, China, and Russia are not in the ICC. But when you vote negative, that argument overall changes as a whole and sort of happens. And because of that, the US is able to change that and sort of dictate it to its own will, which is really bad because there's a lot of impact saying that the US is overall bad for global hegemony and such because of overthrowing global democracies and things like that. Does that make sense?
Yeah, is it also possible like I use the kangaroo court rhetoric on the ICC to frame it in a negative sort of way?
Which rhetoric? Sorry, you cut out.
Like kangaroo court, like politicians use it to describe the ICC already.
Mhm. Yeah, I think you could definitely do that. You just have to make sure that you're wording it well. Any other questions? I'll give you guys until 6:50 if someone wants to unmute, and then I can see if I have any more tips. Wait, um, yeah, I'll give it 3 more minutes, and if anyone has it, and then I can go to some other lay speech tips. Oh yeah, I'm assuming no one has any questions, so I'll go through a few more tips. So obviously we talked about how cases look, but the other thing that I really want to make sure that I mention is that you sort of making sure I've personally found from my experiences that having a scalar impact is usually better. So, for example, if you read a climate change impact, saying something like a 1 degree increase in climate is going to lead to X million amount more dying is something that's a lot more helpful that I found specifically in lay rounds. Next thing that is really sort of important is sort of making sure that you're choosing the right late arguments based off of the circuit that you're going to. So, for example, a lot of you have said that you're going to Harvard or have competed at Stanford. So, sort of understanding the demographic of the judges is something that's really important. For example, let's say you get a judge from Tennessee at Harvard, which I don't think there are any Tennessee teams that are going to Harvard, right? But if you did, what type of arguments do you read? And when it comes to the ICC and Trump being such a central part. So making sure that you read Republican heavy arguments about, hey, Trump is super good is something that you really want to read because essentially these judges are truth over tech. So making sure that you're able to have the best overall argument in that sense. Next, making sure that we already talked about sort of eye contact and don't be not being afraid of sort of defense as a whole. Next thing is that when you're giving rebuttal, making sure that you can group responses when needed. A lot of these really good first, second speakers are going to give like 10 responses on the whole case. And obviously, a lot of us aren't efficient enough to be able to frontline all 10 and then go to their case. So making sure that you're identifying the responses that you need to group the links for and responding from there is something that is super, super important. And the other thing that when I talk about competition attire is that when you walk in, making sure that hey, you're introducing yourself is something that is super helpful. And a really big thing is that you're treating it like a job interview, for example, is is something that I have found that works really, really well in that sense. Um Next thing is, let's see, making sure that you have confidence in in-person rounds. So in my experiences when it comes to in-person rounds, no matter what argument you go for, your confidence matters more. It doesn't matter if you go for one piece of defense on an argument that's really well written. So making sure that you respond to that really well is something that is important, but it's not important as being confident. As a lot of teachers like to say, this is super cliche, but really faking it till you make it is something that is super really important in lay debate. Um, when it comes to sort of final focus and summary, obviously the extensions are super, super important. But the way that I would frame it is first sort of talk about the narrative that you are going for, and then talk about your case, and then go to the weighing. I don't think an order is as important in lay rounds. I would just sort of hit the major voting issues to making sure that you're able to hit everything. And obviously, some of you have coaches, some of you don't. But the biggest way that I think that you can improve at lay rounds is recording your rounds and sort of watching it back again. And the way that I do this is that I sort of follow the golden rule of lay debate in the sense that if I just listen to your final focus, would I be able to understand what happened in the round, what the two arguments that both teams went for was? So that's something that is super interesting of a rule that I have found specifically super helpful. And making sure that you're using valve directed language and chronological is going to make that end so much easier. The last thing that I have is that if you really want to make sure that you're optimizing how you do lay debate, there's a couple of shows slash videos that I think are super important. So anything from 2017, 2018, 2019 PF videos is always super helpful. They at that time the circuit was more focused on this type of debate that you're trying to really improve at. But two, sort of looking at any politician speak, so like Vivek Ramaswamy and things like that, is going to be something that is super easy and um super easy and super efficient to do. Also looking at The Wolf of Wall Street, for example, is something that is super really well done. All right. That's all I had. Does anyone have any questions?
So for like the argument structure, like for the case we looked at and like had like the first, second, should we also have like contentions? Like say contention one is this, like lay judges?
Yeah, you can. Yeah, you can definitely do that. I just say that you can have a choice of either you can do it as contention one, or saying it like as argument one.
Uh,
Anyone else?